Story 1. Thing in the fog. The fog hit my windshield like a living thing, so thick and sudden that I slammed the brakes before my brain even registered what was happening. 1 second I was driving through the Kentucky backroads at 2 in the morning. The next I was blind, surrounded by a wall of grays so dense my headlights couldn't penetrate more than 3 feet. Then my engine died, radio cut out mid-song. Dashboard lights flickered once and went dark. Even my phone screen went black, though it had been fully charged. In 23 years of driving these hills, I never experienced anything like it. I still wish I hadn't. My name is David Brennan, and I repair cell towers for a living. I drive to remote locations at all hours, climbing towers in the middle of nowhere to fix equipment that keeps people connected. That night in October, I was heading home from an emergency repair job near the Tennessee border. I knew those roads like the back of my hand, knew every curve, every pothole, every abandoned barn. But when that fog rolled in, I might as well have been on another planet. The silence was the first thing that really got to me. Not normal quiet, but a complete absence of sound that made my ears ring. No engine tick, no wind against the windows. Even my breathing seemed muffled, like the fog was swallowing every noise before it could travel. I tried the ignition. Nothing, not even a click. The battery was fine. I just replaced it, but the truck was completely dead. That's when I heard the crying. It started soft, barely audible through the supernatural quiet. A child. A sob, high and desperate, coming from somewhere in front of my truck. My parental instincts kicked in immediately. I have 2 kids of my own, 8 and 10, and the sound of a child in distress hits me in the gut every time. But something was wrong with this crying. It was too perfect, too consistent, like a recording on loop. The pitch never varied. The rhythm never changed. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, relieved when it actually turned on. The beam barely penetrated the fog, creating a small cone of visibility that ended abruptly in that gray wall. I rolled down my window manually, and the fog immediately began creeping into the cab like exploring fingers. It was warm, which made no sense for October in Kentucky. Warm and humid and wrong, carrying a smell like copper pennies and rotting flowers. The crying grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Against every horror movie rule I ever yelled at characters for breaking, I opened my door. I had to. What if there really was a kid out there? What if there had been an accident? I couldn't live with myself if I sat in my truck while a child needed help. The moment my boots hit the asphalt, the crying stopped, cut off mid-sob like someone had hit a switch. The silence rushed back, even heavier than before. I stood there, flashlight beam sweeping uselessly through the fog, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. The crying started again, but now it was behind my truck. The exact same sound, the exact same rhythm, but the location had changed instantly. No footsteps, no movement, just suddenly there. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching nothing but gray. The fog seemed to pulse, growing thicker and thinner in waves that didn't match any wind pattern. Then the crying changed. It deepened, aged decades in seconds, morphing from a child's sob into a woman's wail of grief. The kind of sound you hear at funerals when someone loses everything. Raw, primal, devastating. It circled my truck slowly, counterclockwise, maintaining the same distance. I turned with it, trying to keep the sound in front of me, but it was always just out of sight, just beyond the reach of my light. I backed against my truck door, fumbling for the handle. The metal was ice cold despite the warm fog, so cold it burned my palm. The woman's crying grew louder, more desperate, and then split. One voice became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became a dozen, all different women, all different types of grief, surrounding me in a chorus of sorrow that made my chest tight with secondhand anguish. Then, as suddenly as it had multiplied, it stopped. Complete silence for 3 heartbeats. The laughter started on the 4th beat. It began as a giggle, light and playful, like children at recess. But there was something underneath it, something predatory and ancient that made every hair on my body stand up. The giggle grew into a chuckle, then a full laugh, then a cacophony of hysterical shrieking laughter that came from everywhere at once. Above me, below me, inside the fog itself. It wasn't human. It couldn't be human. Human throats couldn't make those sounds, couldn't hold those notes, couldn't You layer those harmonics that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I scrambled back into my truck and slammed the door, but the laughter penetrated the windows like they weren't there. It was inside the cab with me, inside my head, inside my bones. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just entering through my ears anymore. I could feel it vibrating through my chest, taste it on my tongue like electricity. Then I saw the shapes in the fog. They weren't people. They weren't animals. They were suggestions of forms, hints of something massive moving just beyond visibility. The fog would thin for a split second, and I could catch a glimpse of something that my brain refused to process. Too many angles, too many joints, movement that violated physics. Each glimpse was different, like whatever was out there was constantly changing, or like there were dozens of different things, all wrong, all impossible, all focused on my truck. The laughter reached a crescendo that made my nose bleed, and then cut off. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. I sat there, blood dripping onto my shirt, waiting. The fog began to pulse again, and with each pulse, my truck rocked slightly, like something enormous was breathing on it. That is when I noticed the condensation on my windshield was forming patterns. Not random water droplets, but symbols. They looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. Curved lines that hurt to look at, angles that seemed to fold in on themselves. As I watched, frozen in terror, the symbols rearranged themselves into something I could read. 3 words in shaky, childlike handwriting. "We are hungry." The fog pressed against my windows harder, and I heard the glass creak. The temperature inside the cab dropped 30 degrees in seconds. My breath came out in clouds, mixing with the fog that was somehow seeping through invisible gaps. The smell was stronger now, copper and decay and something else, something organic and wrong that made me gag. The shapes in the fog moved closer. I could see them more clearly now, and I wished I couldn't. They weren't solid things, but collections of parts that shouldn't exist together. A mass of eyes that blinked in sequence. Mouths that opened in places mouths shouldn't be. Limbs that bent in too many directions. And they were all moving toward my truck, surrounding it, pressing against it. My truck suddenly roared to life. Engine running, lights blazing, radio blasting static at maximum volume. I didn't question it. I threw it in drive and floored it, driving blind into the fog. I could hear things hitting the truck, wet slapping sounds like raw meat against metal. The windshield cracked. Something left deep gouges in the passenger door, but I kept driving, following the road by memory and instinct. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, I burst out of the fog like breaking through a membrane. The transition was instant and jarring. 1 second I was blind, the next I could see the clear night sky and empty road ahead. In my rearview mirror, the fog bank sat across the road like a solid wall, not dispersing, not moving, just waiting. I drove for 30 miles before I stopped shaking enough to pull over. When I got out to inspect my truck, I found things that still give me nightmares. The gouges in the door were real, 5 parallel cuts that went through the metal. The windshield was cracked in a spider web pattern that centered on what looked like a handprint, if hands had 7 fingers. And covering the entire truck was a thin film of something organic, like dried saliva or mucus, that took 3 professional detailings to fully remove. I reported the incident to the state police. They found nothing, no fog bank, no unusual weather patterns, no reports from other drivers. But they did tell me something that made my blood run cold. Over the past decade, 17 people had gone missing on that stretch of road. Their vehicles were found abandoned, engines running, doors open. No signs of struggle, no bodies ever recovered. I did my own research. The disappearances went back further than a decade. Much further. I found newspaper articles from the 1950s describing a devil fog that would appear without warning. Local folklore from the 1800s about a hungry mist that would roll down from the hills. Native American oral histories warning about a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, where things that shouldn't exist could push through. 3 months later, I was watching the news when they reported a family of 4 missing on that same road. Their minivan was found at dawn, engine running, doors open, toys scattered on the asphalt. The reporter mentioned that locals claimed to have seen an unusual fog bank the night before, but weather services showed no atmospheric conditions that could have caused it. I wanted to help, to warn people. But who would believe me? I tried posting online, but my accounts got flagged as disinformation. I tried talking to local authorities, but they looked at me like I was crazy. So I did the only thing I could do. I quit my job and took a new one 3 states away. I couldn't risk driving those roads anymore. Couldn't risk encountering that fog again. But it is following me. Or maybe there is more than one. Last week, driving through Texas, I saw a wall of fog ahead on a clear night. I turned around and drove 8 hours out of my way to avoid it. Yesterday, in Arizona, my radio cut to static for just a second, and I heard that laughter underneath the white noise. This morning, I found condensation on my bathroom mirror in the shape of those same impossible symbols. They marked me that night in Kentucky. Whatever those things in the fog were, they tasted me, and now they want more. I can feel them getting closer, getting bolder. The encounters are becoming more frequent, the signs more obvious. We're not hiding anymore. I am writing this from a motel in Nevada, but I want to be here long. I keep moving, never staying more than 2 nights in one place. They learn to recognize the signs now. The temperature drops. The animals go quiet. Electronics start acting up. And it's that smell, copper and decay, that always comes before the fog. If you ever driving at night and you see a wall of fog that doesn't look natural, that appears too suddenly, that seems too thick, turn around. Dawn, to be a hero. Dawn, to investigate. Dawn, to even slow down. Because once you enter that fog, once you hear the crying that becomes laughing, that becomes hungry, you become part of their food chain. And patient hunters. They'll all follow you forever, waiting for you to let your guard down, waiting for you to stop running. The fog is spreading. The encounters are increasing. Whatever barrier kept them contained is weakening. And those of us who seen them, who survived them, we read the appetizers before the main course. We're coming, all of them, and we're still hungry. Story 2. Man in the black jumpsuit. I woke up to the sound of radios crackling and red and blue lights flashing through my windshield. State troopers surrounded my truck, hands resting on their weapons, faces grim in the dawn light. The problem was, I had no idea how I'd gotten there. 8 hours earlier, I parked my rig in the abandoned lot behind Murphy's truck stop outside Bakersfield. The place had been closed for 3 years, but truckers still use the back lot for overnight parking. No facilities, no security, just cracked asphalt and weeds growing through the concrete. Perfect for a driver who needed 10 hours of mandatory rest and didn't want to pay for a spot at a busy truck stop. I remembered setting my air brakes, locking the doors from the inside, pulling the curtains across my sleeper berth. I remembered the silence of that empty lot, broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic. I remembered falling asleep to the familiar sounds of my cooling engine and the gentle rocking of my cab in the desert wind. Now I was 15 miles away on Highway 99, surrounded by California Highway Patrol officers who looked like they'd seen a ghost. The lead trooper approached my driver's side window. Sergeant Martinez, according to his name tag. His face was pale despite his tan, and his eyes kept darting to something behind my truck. I rolled down the window, trying to process what was happening. My doors were still locked from the inside. The air brakes were still set. My logbook was exactly where I left it. Everything in the cab was normal except for one impossible fact. My 80,000-pound rig had somehow moved 15 miles without me driving it. Sergeant Martinez asked if I'd been drinking. I submitted to a breathalyzer. 0.0. He asked about drugs. I agreed to a field sobriety test. Passed easily. He asked if I remembered anything strange from the night before. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Motor oil mixed with something else. Something organic and wrong. Like meat left too long in the sun. It seemed to be coming from outside the truck, but every time I tried to pinpoint the source, it shifted. The sergeant explained what had happened. A passing motorist had called 911 around 5 a.m., reporting a tractor-trailer driving erratically on the shoulder of Highway 99. No headlights, no taillights, moving at maybe 20 miles per hour in complete darkness. When the first patrol unit arrived, they found my truck exactly where it sat now, engine off, driver apparently asleep. But that wasn't the strangest part. 3 different officers reported seeing a figure in a black jumpsuit running away from my truck as they approached. Tall, thin, moving with an odd gait like his joints didn't work quite right. They'd given chase, but the figure had disappeared into the scrub brush and tumbleweeds. A thorough search with dogs had turned up nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no trace that anyone had ever been there. I told them I had been asleep the entire time. Hadn't heard anything. Hadn't seen anyone. My doors were locked from the inside, which meant whoever they'd seen couldn't have been in my cab. Unless he somehow locked the doors after climbing out, which was impossible given the way truck door locks worked. The officers exchanged glances. Sergeant Martinez asked if I knew anything about the Murphy's truck stop lot, about why it had been abandoned so suddenly 3 years ago. I didn't. I heard it was financial trouble, like a lot of small truck stops that couldn't compete with the big chains. But the way he asked made it clear there was more to the story. Martinez told me about Jimmy Kowalski, a driver who had been found dead in the Murphy's lot in 2018. Apparent heart attack, slumped over his steering wheel. Natural causes, according to the coroner. But there had been strange details. Jimmy's truck had been moved after he died, repositioned in a different part of the lot. The doors were locked from the inside, just like mine. And several witnesses reported seeing a figure in dark clothing near the truck shortly before Jimmy was found. The investigation had gone nowhere. No evidence of foul play. No signs of forced entry. Jimmy was 58, overweight, heavy smoker. Heart attacks happened to truckers all the time. But his death had spooked the other drivers. Business at Murphy's fell off. The owner closed up 6 months later, claiming he couldn't make ends meet. But the strange incidents hadn't stopped. Over the next 2 years, 3 more truckers reported waking up to find their vehicles moved during the night. Always the same pattern. Always after parking in the abandoned Murphy's lot. Always with sightings of a figure in dark clothing fleeing the scene. The truckers were never harmed, just confused and terrified by the impossible relocation of their massive vehicles. Local drivers started avoiding the area. Word spread through the CB networks and truck stop bulletin boards. Murphy's lot became known as cursed ground. Most truckers wouldn't park there for love or money. But I was new to this road, hadn't heard the stories, and now I was part of them. As the officers finished their report, I walked around my truck looking for any sign of what had happened. The tires showed no unusual wear. The engine was cold, consistent with being shut off for hours. The fuel gauge read the same as when I parked. Every mechanical indicator suggested my truck had been sitting motionless all night. But there was something else. On the driver's side of my trailer, about 8 feet off the ground, were handprints. 5-fingered impressions in the road dust that coated my truck. They were huge, easily twice the size of normal human hands, with fingers that seemed too long and joints that bent in wrong directions. The prints led from the front of the trailer to the back, like someone had walked alongside my truck, using the trailer for balance. I pointed them out to Sergeant Martinez. He took photos, but I could see in his expression that this was just one more impossible detail in an already impossible situation. We both knew that no human being could make handprints 8 feet off the ground while walking. Not unless they were on stilts or had arms like a gorilla. The sergeant advised me to avoid the Murphy's lot in the future, to find somewhere else to take my mandatory rest breaks. He gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else. Then the patrol cars pulled away, leaving me alone with my truck and the growing certainty that something had been inside my cab during the night. I climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine. Everything functioned normally, but as I pulled onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I checked my mirrors, I expected to see a figure in a black jumpsuit standing by the roadside. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. That night, I parked at a well-lit truck stop 50 miles away. Paid for a spot right under a security light, surrounded by other drivers. I locked my doors, checked them twice, and set my alarm for every 2 hours. I barely slept. Each time I woke up, I was still in the same spot. Doors still locked, no mysterious relocations, but I could swear I heard footsteps outside my cab. Slow, deliberate steps circling my truck. And that smell was back. Motor oil and decay. The next morning, I called dispatch and requested a different route. Told them I was having mechanical problems that made the California run unsuitable. They reassigned me to Florida runs, and I thought that would be the end of it. But 3 weeks later, I got a call from Sergeant Martinez. Another trucker had been found at the Murphy's lot. This time, the driver didn't wake up on a highway. He didn't wake up at all. Dave Hendricks, a 20-year veteran, had been discovered in his cab at dawn. Doors locked from the inside. Engine off. No signs of forced entry or foul play. The coroner would rule it a heart attack, just like Jimmy Kowalski. But this time, there were security cameras. The abandoned truck stop might not have had power, but a cell tower company had installed motion-activated cameras on the property to catch vandals. The footage showed Dave parking his truck around midnight. Normal procedure. Nothing unusual. Then, at 3:17 a.m., something impossible happened. The truck began moving. No headlights, no engine noise. Just a massive tractor trailer sliding across the asphalt like it weighed nothing. The cameras tracked it as it repositioned itself in a different part of the lot, moving with the fluid motion of something being guided by invisible hands. But it was the figure walking alongside the truck that made my blood freeze. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like a mechanic's jumpsuit that had been stained black with oil and other substances. His gait was wrong, like his legs were too long for his body. His arms swung at his sides with joints that seemed to have too many bends. And his hands, clearly visible in the infrared footage, were enormous. Easily twice normal size, with fingers that stretched and flexed like they were made of rubber. The figure walked the entire perimeter of the truck, those massive hands trailing along the metal surfaces. Then he stopped at the driver's door and seemed to melt through the metal, becoming liquid shadow that flowed into the cab. The cameras showed the truck sitting motionless for the rest of the night. At dawn, the figure emerged the same way it had entered, flowing out through the door like smoke. It walked to the edge of the lot and simply faded away, becoming one with the shadows cast by the rising sun. Sergeant Martinez asked if I recognized the figure. I told him about the handprints on my trailer, about the impossible size and wrong angles of those fingers. We both knew we were dealing with something that defied explanation. The Murphy's lot was officially condemned after that. Chain link fence, no trespassing signs, regular police patrols, but drivers still report seeing lights in the abandoned building at night. Still smell motor oil and death when they pass by on the highway. And sometimes, on lonely stretches of road throughout California, truckers wake up to find themselves somewhere they don't remember going. Doors locked from the inside. No memory of the journey. Just the lingering smell of oil and decay, and the certainty that something had been in their cab during the night. I never park in deserted lots anymore. Always stay at busy truck stops with lights and security. But I know it doesn't matter, because whatever's out there, whatever Jimmy Kowalski became after he died in that lot, it is not bound by distance or barriers. It is still moving trucks in the night. Still walking alongside massive rigs with hands that can guide 80,000 pounds like it is nothing. Still slipping through locked doors like they don't exist. And someday, it might decide that moving trucks isn't enough. Someday, it might decide to take another driver permanently, to add another ghost to whatever collection it is building in that abandoned lot. I just pray it's not my turn next. Story 3. Laughing children of the rest stop. The children were laughing at 3 in the morning at a rest stop that should have been empty. I pulled my 18-wheeler into the deserted parking area off Interstate 40, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City. The fuel gauge was dancing on empty, and my eyelids felt like sandpaper. After 16 hours of straight driving, this rundown rest area looked like salvation, even if the flickering fluorescent lights made everything look sickly and wrong. The moment I killed the engine, I heard them. High-pitched giggles and shrieks of delight echoing through the darkness. Children playing, their voices bright with pure joy despite the ungodly hour. My first thought was relief. At least I wasn't alone in this forgotten slice of nowhere. My second thought was confusion. What kids would be playing at a rest stop after midnight? I climbed down from the cab, my joints creaking after too many hours behind the wheel. The autumn air bit through my flannel shirt, carrying the sound of their laughter on the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the concrete walls of the restroom building like an echo in a canyon. The playground sat in a pool of yellow light about 50 yards from the parking area. Rusted swings moved gently in the breeze, their chains creaking with metallic groans. A merry-go-round spun slowly, its paint peeling like dead skin. Picnic tables sat scattered around the area like forgotten tombstones. But there were no children. I walked closer, my boots crunching on broken glass and scattered leaves. The laughter continued, growing louder as I approached the playground equipment. It sounded like a dozen kids having the time of their lives. The kind of unbridled joy you only hear from children who have forgotten all their troubles and live completely in the moment. Yet the swings hung motionless. The slide stood empty. The monkey bars gleamed silver and unused in the harsh light. My skin crawled as I realized the laughter was coming from thin air itself, as if the sound had been recorded in the very atoms of this place decades ago and was now playing back on an endless loop. I checked every corner of the rest area, behind the restrooms, around the vending machines, even in the sparse grove of trees that bordered the highway. Nothing. No children, no adults. No explanation for the phantom sounds that continued to ring through the night like bells from another world. The laughter began to change. What had sounded joyful and innocent now carried undertones of something else. Desperation, maybe, or longing. The giggles stretched too long, became too high-pitched, as if the children were trying to call out to someone who couldn't, to hear them properly. I was about to retreat to my truck when I noticed the memorial plaque mounted on a concrete post near the playground entrance. Years of weather had worn the bronze surface nearly smooth, but I could still make out the faded inscription in the pale light. It commemorated 23 children and their bus driver who died in a crash at this very location on October 15, 1987. A school field trip cut short by black ice and bad luck. The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. No wind, no highway noise, no insects, just the kind of dead quiet that makes your ears ring and your heart pound. I stood frozen by that memorial, understanding finally washing over me like ice water. They were still here, still waiting for their ride home. A swing began to move on its own, its chains singing a low, mournful song. Then another. Soon the entire playground came alive with invisible activity. The merry-go-round spun faster, its rusted bearings shrieking like wounded animals. The seesaw tilted back and forth as if children were taking turns pushing each other skyward. And then I heard the whispers, not words exactly, but the kind of hushed, excited chatter that kids make when they replanning something secret. The voices were all around me now, tugging at my jacket, pulling at my awareness. They wanted something. They needed something. They wanted me to play. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't the malevolent spirits seeking revenge. They were just children who had been ripped away from life at its sweetest moment, trapped forever in their last happy memory. They were lonely, confused, endlessly waiting for someone to join their games. A small hand touched mine. I couldn't see it, but I felt the tiny fingers wrap around my palm with desperate urgency. The touch was cold as winter air, but somehow still carried the warmth of a child's innocent trust. More hands joined the first, tugging at my clothes, pulling me toward the playground equipment. I wanted to run. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to sprint back to my truck and drive until I reached the next state. But the children, this loneliness was overwhelming, a crushing sadness that seemed to press down on my chest like a physical weight. How long had they been waiting here? How many travelers had heard their laughter and simply driven away? The invisible children led me to the merry-go-round and guided my hands to the metal rails. I began to push, and their laughter returned. Not the desperate sound from before, but genuine happiness. For the first time in decades, someone was playing with them again. I spent an hour at that haunted playground, pushing swings for children I couldn't see, spinning the merry-go-round while phantom voices cheered with delight. Part of me knew I was losing my mind, but a larger part understood that I was giving these lost souls something they desperately needed. Acknowledgement, companionship, proof that they still existed in some form. When I finally said goodbye and walked back to my truck, the laughter followed me. But it was different now. Satisfied, grateful, fading slowly into the night like a favorite song ending. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse in my side mirror of 23 small figures standing by the memorial plaque, waving farewell. I never told anyone about that night. Who would believe such a story? But every time I drive past that exit on Interstate 40, I slow down and listen. Sometimes, if the wind is just right and the hour is late enough, I can still hear them playing in the distance. Those children are still there, still waiting for someone to stop and remember them. Still hoping that the next traveler who hears their laughter will have the courage to step out into the darkness and play. Story 4. Smiling figure at the door. My passenger door was wide open when I woke up, and someone was standing in the darkness just outside my cab, smiling at me with teeth that glowed like moonlight. I pulled off Interstate 35 near Austin around midnight, exhausted after 14 hours of hauling furniture from Dallas to San Antonio. The spot looked perfect, a wide dirt shoulder beside what appeared to be an empty field, far enough from the highway to avoid the noise of passing traffic but close enough to feel safe. The temperature had been in the 80s when I parked, but I woke up shivering in what felt like a meat locker. My breath misted in the air, and frost had formed on the inside of my windshield despite the warm Texas night. The cabin thermometer read 32 degrees, which should have been impossible. That's when I noticed my interior light was on, casting everything in harsh yellow brightness. I always slept in complete darkness, had for 20 years of long-haul driving. The light switch was in the off position, yet somehow the bulb blazed overhead like an interrogation lamp. My passenger door hung open, revealing a rectangle of absolute blackness beyond the cab's illumination. No stars, no distant highway lights, just a void that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The door's electronic lock showed green, still secure according to the system. Yet there it was, gaping wide like a mouth. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands and played the beam into the darkness outside the open door. The light penetrated maybe 3 feet before being absorbed by shadows that felt almost solid. But in that narrow cone of visibility, I could make out a figure standing just beyond the reach of my beam. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit that hung on its frame like funeral clothes on a scarecrow. Its face was pale as paper and split by a grin that stretched wider than any human mouth should go. The teeth were perfect, too white, too many of them crowded into that impossible smile. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the darkness beyond my door, watching me with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like coins at the bottom of a well. Its smile never wavered, never changed, as if it had been carved into place by someone who had never seen a real human expression. I tried to start the engine, but the key turned uselessly in the ignition. No lights, no gauges, nothing. The electrical system was completely dead except for that single interior bulb that continued to burn with steady, unnatural brightness. My CB radio was silent, my cell phone showed no signal, and even my analog watch had stopped at exactly midnight. The cold was getting worse. My breath came in thick clouds, and ice began forming on the metal surfaces inside the cab. My water bottle had frozen solid, and my coffee mug held a solid block of brown ice. Yet outside, through the windshield, I could see heat shimmer rising from the asphalt like it was still summer. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure at my door. It hadn't moved an inch since I first spotted it, but somehow it seemed closer now, as if the darkness itself was bringing it forward without any visible motion. The smile was definitely wider, stretching across a face that was becoming less human with each passing moment. That's when I realized the figure cast no shadow. My flashlight beam passed right through it, illuminating the ground where its feet should have created dark patches. It was there but not there, solid enough to see but transparent to light, a contradiction that made my brain struggle to process what my eyes were showing me. I forced myself to look away and focus on finding some way to start the truck. The engine had to turn over eventually. Electrical problems were fixable. There had to be a logical explanation for everything that was happening. But when I glanced back at the door, the figure was gone. The passenger seat was occupied instead. The same impossibly thin figure now sat beside me, its oversized grin just 3 feet away, its coin-bright eyes fixed on my face with unwavering attention. Up close, I could see that its skin wasn't pale. It was transparent, like looking at something underwater. Veins and bones showed through flesh that seemed more like fog than solid matter. It reached one skeletal hand toward my face, fingers stretched out as if to caress my cheek or perhaps tear my skin away in ribbons. The touch, when it came, was colder than anything I ever felt. Not just cold, but the absence of heat, the opposite of warmth. As if this thing drew energy from living bodies like a spiritual parasite. My vision started to blur around the edges. Darkness crept in from all sides, and I felt my life force being pulled toward that grinning horror beside me. It was feeding, drinking my warmth, my breath, my very existence through its impossible touch. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my windshield and the air was warm again. The passenger door was closed and locked, my electrical system worked perfectly, and the engine started on the first try. Everything was normal except for the thin layer of frost that still clung to my coffee mug and water bottle. I climbed down from the cab to inspect the area where the figure had been standing. The ground was normal Texas dirt and scrub grass, showing no signs of disturbance. But as I looked around to get my bearings, I realized where I spent the night. My truck was parked directly beside an old cemetery that I hadn't noticed in the darkness. Weathered headstones stretched away into the distance, some dating back to the 1800s. A rusted sign near the entrance read Forgotten Souls Memorial Garden, abandoned 1987. The place had been forgotten by the living, but apparently not by the dead. I drove straight to the nearest truck stop and told the night manager what had happened. He listened without skepticism, then showed me a logbook they kept behind the counter. 3 other drivers had reported similar encounters at that exact spot over the past 2 years. All described the same figure, the same impossible smile, the same bone-deep cold in the middle of Texas heat. Local legend says the cemetery's last caretaker died in 1987 and was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the grounds. Some claim he still makes his rounds, checking on overnight visitors who parked too close to his eternal charges. Others believe he is recruiting, looking for living souls to join the permanent residents in their forgotten garden. I don't know what I encountered that night beside the cemetery, but I know it was real and it was hungry for something only the living possess. The frost on my coffee mug took 3 days to completely melt, and sometimes, when I am driving through Texas on particularly dark nights, I still see that impossible smile in my rearview mirror. Some parking spots aren't meant for the living, and some visitors never really leave. Story 5. Shoulder walker of I-5. I never believed in ghost stories until I started seeing the walkers on Interstate 5. My name is Marcus, and I drive freight between Vancouver and San Francisco twice a month. Same route, same truck stops, same stretches of endless black asphalt cutting through Oregon forests and California valleys. 23 years they've been making this run, and I thought I knew every mile marker, every exit, every shadow cast by moonlight on concrete. I was wrong. It started 3 months ago on a foggy October night somewhere between Redding and Sacramento. The clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. when I first saw her, an elderly woman in a pale hospital gown walking slowly along the shoulder. Her bare feet moved in perfect rhythm against the gravel, arms swinging naturally at her sides like she was taking a casual stroll through a park instead of wandering a desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. My first instinct was to pull over. You don't leave people stranded on dark roads, especially not fragile-looking grandmothers who clearly needed help. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way she never looked back at my approaching headlights, or how her hospital gown stayed perfectly white despite the dirt and debris that should have stained it after walking God knows how many miles. I slowed down, watching her in my side mirror as I passed. She just kept walking, never breaking stride, never acknowledging the 18-wheeler rumbling past her. The fog swallowed her figure within seconds, and I convinced myself she was probably a confused patient who had wandered away from some nearby medical facility. Someone else would find her. Someone else would help. I was 20 miles down the road when I realized there were no hospitals for at least 50 miles in either direction. The next trip north, I kept my eyes peeled for any mention of missing persons on the local news stations. Nothing. No reports of escaped patients. No Amber Alerts. No search parties combing the roadside. It was like she had never existed at all. But 2 weeks later, heading south again, I saw another one. This time it was a middle-aged man in blue scrubs, walking the same stretch of highway with that same unhurried pace. Same white clothing that seemed to glow against the darkness. Same complete indifference to passing traffic. I slowed down enough to get a better look at his face, and what I saw made my hands shake on the steering wheel. His eyes were completely white, not clouded by cataracts or injury, but white like fresh paint, reflecting my headlights with an unnatural brightness. His mouth hung slightly open, and I could see his tongue moving constantly, like he was having a conversation with someone I couldn't see. I floored the accelerator and didn't look back. That's when I started calling them shoulder walkers. I began documenting every sighting in a notebook I kept in my glove compartment. Time, location, description, weather conditions, anything that might help me understand what I was seeing. The pattern became clear after 6 more trips. They only appeared on the most isolated stretches of I-5, always between midnight and 4 a.m. They were always wearing white clothing, hospital gowns, scrubs, lab coats, nursing uniforms. They walked exclusively on the southbound shoulder, moving in the same direction as traffic but at a speed that seemed impossibly consistent. Most disturbing of all, they never seemed to age or change, like they were stuck in some endless loop of walking. I started planning my routes to avoid those sections of highway during the peak hours, but freight schedules don't bend to accommodate driver superstitions. My dispatcher would laugh if I told him I needed to reschedule deliveries because of ghost sightings. So I kept driving, and I kept seeing them. By January, I had recorded 17 different shoulder walkers in my notebook. The elderly woman in the hospital gown, the man with white eyes, a young nurse pushing an empty wheelchair, an orderly carrying what looked like medical files that never scattered despite the wind from passing trucks. Each one walking their eternal journey south, never deviating from their path, never acknowledging the world around them. I developed theories. Maybe there had been a hospital bus accident years ago that was covered up. Maybe there was some kind of chemical leak that affected people's minds, turning them into mindless wanderers. Maybe it was all an elaborate hoax, some kind of viral marketing stunt for a horror movie. The rational explanations helped me sleep at night, even if they didn't quite explain everything I was witnessing. The turning point came on a rainy February morning when I saw the woman from my first sighting again. Same hospital gown, same measured pace, same stretch of highway. But this time, something was different. As I approached in the right lane, she turned her head and looked directly at me through my windshield. She smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Her lips stretched wider than any human mouth should stretch, revealing teeth that seemed to go back too far into her skull. But what froze my blood wasn't the grotesque expression. It was the recognition in her eyes. She knew me. She had been waiting for me to return. I swerved into the left lane so hard that my trailer nearly jackknifed, but I managed to maintain control. When I checked my mirrors, she was still there, still smiling that impossible smile, now waving at me with slow, deliberate movements. That night at the truck stop, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my cab with my notebook, staring at all the entries I had made over the past 4 months. 17 different shoulder walkers, but now I was starting to notice disturbing patterns in their appearances. The man with white eyes had the same facial structure as the elderly woman. The young nurse had similar bone structure to the orderly. The more I studied my descriptions, the more I realized they might not be different people at all. They might be the same person, changing form each time I saw them. The next southbound trip was my breaking point. I had planned to take an alternate route, but a rockslide closed Highway 101, forcing me back onto I-5. As I entered the usual stretch where the shoulder walkers appeared, I saw not one, but 5 of them spaced out along the roadside, all wearing different white uniforms, all walking at that same measured pace, all moving in perfect synchronization like some kind of macabre parade. But it was the 6th one that made me slam on my brakes. She was standing still in the middle of the shoulder, facing the road. The elderly woman from my first sighting, hospital gown fluttering in the wind from passing cars. Her arms were stretched out toward the highway like she was trying to hitchhike, but her face held that same impossibly wide smile. Even from a distance, I could see her mouth moving, forming words I couldn't hear over the rumble of my engine. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but something deeper, maybe curiosity, maybe compassion for what she might have been before whatever happened to her, made me pull over onto the shoulder about 50 yards ahead of where she stood. I left my engine running and grabbed the baseball bat I kept behind my seat. The rain had stopped, but fog was rolling in from the surrounding hills, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. I could hear her footsteps on the gravel before I could see her approaching my truck. She walked up to my driver's side door with that same unhurried pace, her bare feet making soft scraping sounds against the asphalt. Up close, her hospital gown looked ancient, like it had been white decades ago but was now yellowed with age and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Her skin was pale as moonlight, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones and sunken eye sockets. But it was her eyes that made me grip the bat tighter. They were completely lucid, intelligent, human. Whatever she was, there was still consciousness behind those eyes, still awareness of what was happening around her. She stopped about 3 feet from my door and tilted her head like a curious bird. When she spoke, her voice was clear and surprisingly normal, with just a hint of a southern accent that reminded me of my grandmother. They've been watching us, she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. I couldn't find my voice to respond. My throat felt like it was full of sand. She stepped closer, and I noticed that despite walking for months along dirty highways, her feet were completely clean. No cuts, no bruises, no calluses, like they had never actually touched the ground. They've been waiting for someone like you, she continued, that grotesque smile never leaving her face. Someone who sees, someone who understands that some roads don't lead anywhere good. What are you? I finally managed to whisper. She laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with wind chimes. What happens when people take the wrong exit? When they follow directions that lead to places that don't exist on any map. When they trust voices that whisper turn left at the abandoned gas station, turn right at the dead oak tree, keep driving until you see the white building with no windows. She pressed her palm against my door, and I could feel the cold radiating through the metal. We found that building. You see, we all did, eventually. Different times, different years, but we all ended up at the same place. The white building where they told us to wait, where they promised someone would come for us, where they gave us these clothes and told us to walk until we found our way home. Her smile grew wider, stretching beyond the boundaries of her face. But here, it's the thing about that building. It's not on your maps because it exists between places. In the spaces where reality gets thin, and once they've been there, they've worn their clothes and followed their instructions, you can never quite leave. You just walk and walk and walk, hoping someone will finally stop and help you remember which direction leads back to the world you came from. I wanted to start my truck and drive away, but my hands wouldn't move. Her eyes held mine with an intensity that made my vision blur around the edges. The others, they were all me. Different versions from different times, different attempts to find the way home. But each time I walk this road, I lose a little more of what I used to be. Pretty soon, there won't be enough left to remember why I'm walking at all. She leaned closer, and I could smell something sweet and rotten on her breath, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. But you can help me, she whispered. You can give me something new to be, something with a truck and a route and a purpose. All you have to do is get out and walk with me for just a little while. Just until I remember what it feels like to be going somewhere instead of just moving. Her fingers found the door handle, and despite being locked, it turned easily in her grip. The door swung open with a rusty creak that seemed to echo through the fog like a scream. Just a short walk, she repeated, reaching for my ankle with fingers that felt like ice through my jeans. Just until morning, just until I remember. The moment her skin touched mine, the world changed. The highway disappeared, replaced by a straight white corridor that stretched infinitely in both directions. The walls were covered with doorways, thousands of them, each one leading to darkness. I could hear voices calling from beyond those doors, lost, desperate voices begging someone to help them find their way home. I realized with growing horror that I was looking at the white building she had described. The place between places where lost travelers ended up when they followed the wrong directions. And now I was here too, wearing clothes that were slowly turning white, feeling an overwhelming urge to start walking down that endless corridor. But I still had my baseball bat. I swung it as hard as I could, not at her, but at the nearest doorway. The impact sent shockwaves through the white walls, and for a moment, I could see cracks spreading across what I had thought was solid reality. Through the cracks, I caught glimpses of the highway, my truck, the foggy night I had left behind. The elderly woman screamed, but it wasn't the sound of pain. It was the sound of something being torn away from its anchor. Her grip on my ankle loosened, and I used that moment to kick free and dive toward the largest crack in the wall. I fell through darkness and landed hard on wet asphalt, gasping and shaking beside my truck. The shoulder walker was gone, but I could still hear her voice carried on the wind, fading as she resumed her eternal walk. You can help me, she called out. But maybe you can warn them. Tell them not to stop. Tell them not to listen when we ask for help. Tell them some people are lost for reasons that go deeper than wrong turns and empty gas tanks. I got back in my truck and drove nonstop until I reached Sacramento, where I sat in a diner parking lot until sunrise, trying to convince myself that what had happened was just a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road and too little sleep. But I knew better. I had touched something that existed in the spaces between reality and madness, between helping and being helped, between finding your way home and walking forever toward a destination that doesn't exist. I still drive I-5. I still make my deliveries on schedule. But now I know that some of the people you see walking along dark highways aren't looking for rides or assistance. They're looking for replacements, for someone new to take their place in the endless journey between one nowhere and another. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in and the highway stretches empty and black ahead of my headlights, I see her again. Always walking south, always wearing that yellowed hospital gown, always smiling that impossible smile. But now she waves at me like an old friend, and I wave back, because I understand something I didn't before. We're all just walking toward destinations we'll never reach, following directions that lead us further from home with every step. The only difference is that most people get to stop walking when they retired. The shoulder walkers never get to rest. Story 6. Knock that shakes the rig. The knocking started at exactly 3:33 a.m., and it was loud enough to shake 60,000 pounds of steel like a toy. My name is Dave, and I haul freight across the continental United States. 28 years behind the wheel, and I thought I had seen everything the road could throw at me. Bad weather, aggressive drivers, truck stop weirdos, mechanical breakdowns in the middle of nowhere. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that moonless night in rural Pennsylvania, parked behind 2 other rigs on a forgotten stretch of roadside that does not appear on any official rest stop maps. I had been driving for 11 hours straight when fatigue finally forced me to pull over. The GPS showed I was somewhere between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, but the darkness outside was so complete that I might as well have been on another planet. No streetlights, no house lights, no signs of civilization except for the cracked asphalt beneath my tires and the 2 other 18-wheelers already parked in what looked like an unofficial trucker's rest area. The spot was nothing more than a wide shoulder carved out of dense Pennsylvania forest, probably used by loggers decades ago and long forgotten by the State Highway Department. Tall pine trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even moonlight could not penetrate. The air smelled of pine needles and something else I could not identify. Something sweet and organic that reminded me of compost piles behind garden centers. I backed my rig into position about 50 feet behind the second truck, killed the engine, and climbed into my sleeper berth. The silence was absolute except for the occasional settling sounds my truck made as it cooled down. No traffic noise, no distant train horns, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the kind of deep quiet that makes your ears ring and your mind start playing tricks on you. I had been asleep for maybe 3 hours when the knocking started. It was not the polite tap 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 of someone trying to wake a driver for directions or emergency assistance. This was violent, aggressive pounding that seemed to come from both sides of my cab simultaneously. The entire truck rocked on its suspension as something hammered against my driver door with enough force to make the windows rattle in their frames. At the same moment, identical pounding erupted on the passenger side, creating a horrible stereo effect that made it impossible to determine which direction the threat was coming from. I sat up in my bunk, heart hammering against my ribs, completely disoriented. The pounding continued with mechanical precision, each impact perfectly synchronized between both doors. Whatever was out there had to be huge to generate that kind of force, or there had to be multiple somethings working together with impossible coordination. The knocking followed no human pattern. It was too fast, too rhythmic, too perfectly timed to be made by fists or tools wielded by confused or desperate people. Each impact lasted exactly the same duration, with exactly the same pause between strikes, like a machine designed specifically to terrorize sleeping truckers. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled toward the front of the cab, staying low to avoid being seen through the windshield. The pounding continued, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. My entire truck was shaking so hard that loose items were falling from their storage compartments. Coffee mugs rattled against each other, papers scattered across the floor, and my CB radio crackled with static that sounded almost like whispered voices. Through the driver's side window, I could see the vague outline of the truck parked ahead of me. Its running lights were on, and I could hear its diesel engine turning over in the desperate, grinding way engines sound when someone is trying to start them quickly. The driver was awake. The driver was scared. The driver was trying to get the hell out of there just like I wanted to. But the knocking on my truck continued, violent and relentless. I pressed my face against the cold glass and aimed my flashlight beam down toward where my driver door should be. The light revealed nothing but empty air and pine needles scattered across wet asphalt. No person, no animal, no object that could be creating the deafening impacts that were still shaking my entire rig. The beam of my flashlight trembled as another series of synchronized strikes hit both doors. I could feel the vibrations through the floor, through the steering wheel, through every piece of metal in my cab. Whatever was out there was not just knocking on my doors. It was trying to get inside. That is when I noticed the third truck. The rig parked farthest ahead had its headlights blazing, illuminating the tree line in harsh white light. I could see its exhaust stack belching black smoke as the driver revved his engine, preparing to pull out. But in the split second before he engaged his transmission, his headlights swept across the area between our trucks, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. Shadows. Dozens of human-shaped shadows moving between the vehicles with quick, jerky movements like stop-motion animation. But there were no people casting those shadows. The shadows existed independently, sliding across the ground and up the sides of our trucks without any physical forms to create them. The first truck lurched forward with a roar of diesel exhaust and grinding gears. Its trailer swayed dangerously as the driver accelerated too quickly, but he managed to maintain control and disappeared into the darkness beyond the tree line. The second truck followed immediately, its engine screaming as the driver pushed it harder than any loaded rig should be pushed on a narrow forest road. And suddenly I was alone with whatever was trying to get into my cab. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the violent pounding. I could hear my own breathing, the tick of my cooling engine, the whisper of wind through pine branches. But underneath those normal sounds, there was something else. A soft scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across metal, coming from directly above my head. Something was on my roof. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, hoping to raise one of the other drivers who had fled. Static filled my cab, punctuated by brief bursts of what sounded like voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. The words were fast and guttural, almost like recordings played backward at high speed. Then I heard something that made me drop the microphone. My own voice was coming through the radio, calling for help. But I was not speaking. The voice was mine, but it was saying things I had never said, describing a truck breakdown that had not happened, begging for someone to come to coordinates that did not match my actual location. The scraping on my roof intensified, moving from the front of my cab toward the back in deliberate patterns. Whatever was up there was exploring, learning the layout of my truck, maybe looking for a way inside. I could hear it testing the various vents and access panels, probing for weaknesses with what sounded like long, thin fingers. I had to get out of there. My engine turned over on the first try, but as soon as I shifted into drive, the scraping stopped. The sudden silence was ominous, like the pause between lightning and thunder. I knew something was about to happen, something worse than knocking or scraping or mysterious shadows. I pressed the accelerator, and my truck lurched forward. But instead of the familiar sensation of wheels rolling on asphalt, it felt like I was driving through thick mud or sand. The engine strained against some invisible resistance, and my speedometer showed increasing speed even though the trees outside my windows barely seemed to be moving. That is when I realized the road was wrong. When I had parked, the road ahead was straight for at least a quarter mile before curving left around a hill. Now, in my headlights, I could see that the road curved sharply to the right, leading deeper into the forest. The trees were different too, shorter and more gnarled, with branches that hung low enough to scrape against my trailer. The asphalt beneath my tires had changed from the smooth modern surface I remembered to rough, cracked pavement that looked like it had not been maintained in decades. I was not driving on the same road where I had stopped to rest. My CB radio crackled back to life, and this time the voice coming through was clear and human. It was the driver from the first truck, the one who had fled ahead of me. He was calling for help. He was describing the same impossible knocking, the same shadows without forms, the same wrong road that seemed to lead nowhere. But according to his transmission, he had been driving for hours trying to find his way back to the interstate. Hours, even though he had left only minutes before me. Then I heard the second driver chime in, panic evident in his voice. He was lost too, driving in circles through forest roads that did not appear on any map, burning fuel he could not afford to waste, seeing things in his mirrors that disappeared when he looked directly at them. We were all trapped in the same impossible place. I tried to respond, to coordinate our efforts to find a way out, but when I keyed the microphone, no sound came from my radio. Instead, I heard my voice broadcasting on the frequency, but it was not saying what I was trying to say. The voice that sounded like mine was giving directions to other truckers, telling them about a great place to rest for the night just off the interstate in Pennsylvania. It was describing the exact spot where I had originally parked, using my voice to lure more victims into whatever trap we had stumbled into. The road ahead split into 3 directions, none of which had been there moments before. My headlights illuminated 3 different paths leading deeper into the forest, each one looking more treacherous than the last. But there was no choice except to pick one and keep driving, because stopping meant facing whatever had been knocking on my doors, whatever had been scraping across my roof. whatever was turning my voice into bait for other unsuspecting drivers. I took the middle path, and immediately the temperature inside my cab began to drop. My breath started fogging despite the heater running at full blast. The windows began to frost over from the inside, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like twisted human faces pressed against the glass from within. That is when I understood what was happening to us. We had not just stopped at the wrong rest area. We had somehow driven off the edge of the normal world into a place that existed parallel to our reality. A place where roads led in impossible directions and shadows moved independently of the objects that should cast them. The knocking had not been an attempt to get into our trucks. It had been a signal, a marker that indicated we had crossed from one reality into another. The voices on the radio confirmed my theory. As I drove deeper into the maze of forest roads, I began picking up transmissions from truckers who claimed to have been lost in this place for days, weeks, even months. Their voices were desperate, confused, gradually losing coherence as they described increasingly impossible experiences. Some spoke of roads that climbed vertically up mountainsides that had not existed the day before. Others reported driving through towns populated entirely by empty vehicles, their headlights on but no drivers visible behind the wheels. One voice, crackling through heavy static, belonged to a driver who claimed to have been trapped for 6 months. He described how the place changed around him, how the roads rearranged themselves each night, how his fuel gauge never moved despite constant driving, and how he sometimes caught glimpses of the real world through cracks in the sky that appeared at dawn and disappeared by sunset. But the most terrifying transmission came from a driver who said he had found a way out. His voice was calm, almost cheerful, as he described the exit route he had discovered. All you had to do was stop your truck, turn off your engine, and wait for the knocking to start again. When it did, you had to get out of your cab and walk directly toward the sound, no matter what you saw or heard along the way. He promised that following the knocking would lead you back to the real world, back to the interstate, back to safety. Several other voices on the radio confirmed that this method worked. They encouraged any lost drivers to try it, to trust the knocking, to follow it home. But I noticed something that chilled me more than the frost on my windows. All of these encouraging voices sounded exactly like mine. They were all using my voice, my inflection, my speech patterns to convince other trapped truckers to get out of their vehicles and walk toward whatever had been trying to get into our cabs. The thing that had copied my voice on the radio was now using it to create an entire chorus of false hope, designed to lure desperate drivers out of the only protection they had. I realized that every driver who had fallen for this trick was probably dead, and now their voices would be added to the chorus, used to deceive the next group of victims who stumbled into this impossible place. The road ahead of me began to slope upward at an angle that should have been impossible for a loaded truck to climb. But my rig kept moving forward, defying physics and common sense, carrying me higher into the dark forest toward some destination I could not imagine. As I climbed, I began to see lights in the distance. Not electric lights, but something that flickered and danced like flames. As I got closer, I could see that the lights were coming from other trucks, dozens of them, parked in a vast clearing at the top of the impossible hill. All of their engines were running, all of their headlights were blazing, but there were no drivers visible in any of the cabs. I pulled into the clearing and parked among the ghost fleet, my engine joining the chorus of diesels that rumbled constantly in this place outside reality. Through my windshield, I could see that some of these trucks were ancient, their paint faded and their chrome corroded by decades of exposure. Others looked newer, but still bore the marks of long abandonment. This was where lost truckers ended up. This was the final destination for drivers who followed the wrong directions, who trusted the wrong voices, who stopped at the wrong rest areas in the middle of the night. But as I sat there among the ghost fleet, I noticed something that gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt since the knocking started. Some of the trucks were empty, but others were not. I could see shapes moving in their cabs, silhouettes of drivers who were still alive, still fighting against whatever force had brought them here. They were survivors, like me, refusing to give up, refusing to walk toward the knocking that would lead them to join whatever entities now use their voices to deceive others. I grabbed my CB radio and tried a different frequency, one that truckers used for emergency communications. Static filled my speakers, but underneath the white noise, I could hear whispered voices calling out coordinates, real coordinates that corresponded to actual locations on maps that existed in the real world. The survivors were working together, sharing information, trying to find a way home. I keyed my microphone and whispered my own coordinates, adding my voice to theirs. But I made sure to speak quietly, because I could hear other things moving between the parked trucks, things that mimicked human footsteps but fell into rhythms no human could maintain. The knocking had followed us here. It moved from truck to truck in the ghost fleet, testing doors and windows, searching for drivers who might be tempted to give up and step outside. But the survivors knew better. We had learned that the only safety lay in staying mobile, staying inside our rigs, and ignoring the voices that promised easy exits from this nightmare. As dawn approached, cracks began to appear in the sky above the clearing. Through these rifts, I could see glimpses of the real world, interstate highways, normal traffic, sunrise over familiar landscapes. The survivors' coordinates were navigation points for reaching these cracks, temporary doorways that opened at specific times and locations throughout this impossible realm. I started my engine and followed the whispered instructions, racing toward a crack that would close within minutes. Behind me, I could hear the knocking spreading through the ghost fleet as the entities that controlled this place realized what we were attempting. But some roads lead home, even from places that should not exist. I made it through. Now I drive the same routes I always have, but I carry a list of coordinates whispered by other survivors, and I monitor emergency frequencies for voices that sound too familiar, too encouraging, too eager to help lost drivers find places to rest. Because somewhere in Pennsylvania, there is still a clearing full of empty trucks where the knocking never stops, and the voices that call for help are always your own. Story 7. Phantom hitchhiker of Route 66. The woman who disappeared from my passenger seat was already dead when I picked her up. I know that sounds impossible, but after 3 weeks of investigating what happened to me on Route 66, I have learned that death is not always the end of the journey. Sometimes it is just a transfer to a different kind of road, one that runs parallel to ours but leads to destinations that do not appear on any map. My name is Rick, and I am a pharmaceutical sales representative who covers the Southwest Territory. I drive about 40,000 miles a year, mostly on interstates and major highways, selling medical supplies to hospitals and clinics across Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I have been doing this job for 12 years, and I thought I knew every mile of asphalt between Phoenix and Albuquerque. I was wrong. It happened on a Thursday night in October, somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow on the old Route 66. I was running behind schedule after a long meeting at the Flagstaff Medical Center, and I decided to take the historic route instead of staying on I-40. The old highway runs roughly parallel to the interstate through some of the most isolated country in Arizona, passing through ghost towns and abandoned settlements that were bypassed when the modern highway system was built in the 60s. The sun had set hours ago, and my headlights cut through darkness so complete it felt like driving through black velvet. No other traffic, no lights from houses or businesses, just endless miles of cracked asphalt winding through high desert scrubland. The only sound was the hum of my tires and the distant howl of wind across the mesas. That is when I saw the truck stop. It appeared in my headlights like something from a fever dream, a massive concrete structure squatting beside the highway like a beached whale. The building had to be at least 50 years old, all sharp angles and faded paint, with a huge neon sign that flickered weakly in the darkness. Most of the letters were burned out, leaving only random fragments that spelled nothing coherent. But it was not the building that made me slow down. It was the woman standing beside the road. She was young, maybe 25, wearing a thin white dress that seemed to glow in my headlights. Her long dark hair whipped around her face in the desert wind, and she was holding one arm up in the universal gesture of someone seeking a ride. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel even as I pulled over to help her. She had no shadow. The harsh glare of my headlights should have cast a clear shadow behind her, but the ground was empty. It was as if she was somehow not quite solid enough to block the light, not quite present enough to leave a mark on the physical world. But she was shivering, and she looked scared, and 12 years of driving through lonely places had taught me never to leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window. She approached my car with quick, nervous steps, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder as if something was following her. Up close, she looked even younger, with pale skin and large dark eyes that seemed too big for her face. Her dress was simple cotton, the kind of thing someone might wear to church or a family gathering, but completely inadequate for the cold desert night. She leaned down to my window and spoke in a voice so soft I had to strain to hear her over the wind. She said she was cold. So very cold. She asked if I could give her a ride to Winslow, to an address on the old side of town where her family was waiting for her. She promised it was not far, maybe 20 miles down the road. I told her to get in, and she climbed into my passenger seat with movements that seemed oddly weightless, as if she was not quite subject to the same gravity that affected everything else. The interior light came on automatically when she opened the door, and I got my first clear look at her face. She was beautiful in the way that old photographs are beautiful, with perfect features that seemed somehow timeless. But her skin was pale as porcelain, and when she smiled to thank me, I noticed that her lips had a blue tint that suggested hypothermia or worse. The temperature inside my car dropped 20 degrees the moment she settled into the seat. My breath started fogging, and I could see hers as well, little puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the suddenly frigid air. I turned the heater up to maximum, but it seemed to have no effect on the cold that radiated from her like she was made of ice. She gave me an address on Kinsley Avenue in Winslow, speaking the numbers clearly but offering no other conversation. When I asked her name, she just smiled and said it did not matter anymore. When I asked how she had ended up stranded at that abandoned truck stop, she turned to look out the passenger window and remained silent for the rest of the drive. But I could feel her presence beside me like a weight that pressed down on my chest and made breathing difficult. The air in the car grew thicker with each mile, and I began to smell something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a closed room. The radio started acting strangely about 10 minutes into the drive. I had been listening to a classic rock station out of Flagstaff, but the signal kept fading in and out, replaced by bursts of static that almost sounded like voices speaking in languages I did not recognize. Sometimes the static would clear for a few seconds, and I would hear what sounded like emergency broadcasts describing accidents and missing persons reports from decades past. My passenger seemed unaffected by the radio problems. She sat perfectly still, staring out at the darkness, occasionally raising one hand to touch the window glass. Her fingers left no marks on the glass, no condensation, no proof that she had touched anything at all. The drive to Winslow normally takes about 20 minutes on Route 66, but that night it seemed to take hours. The landscape outside my windows became increasingly surreal as we drove, with rock formations that looked like ancient ruins and dead trees twisted into shapes that resembled human figures reaching toward the sky. The road itself began to feel different, rougher and narrower than I remembered, as if we were driving on some older version of the highway that existed beneath the modern pavement. When we finally reached the outskirts of Winslow, my passenger directed me through a series of turns that led away from the main commercial district and into a residential area I had never seen before. The houses were old, built in the 40s and 50s, with small yards and chain-link fences. Most of them looked abandoned, with broken windows and yards overgrown with weeds. Kinsley Avenue turned out to be a dead-end street lined with small ranch houses that had been elegant once but were now falling into decay. The address my passenger had given me corresponded to a house at the very end of the street, a modest brick structure with a front porch that sagged under the weight of years and neglect. There were no lights on in any of the windows, no cars in the driveway, no signs of life at all. I pulled into the driveway and turned to tell my passenger that we had arrived. The words died in my throat when I looked at the empty seat beside me. She was gone. The passenger seat was not just empty, it was cold. When I reached over to touch the fabric, frost cracked under my fingers. The seatbelt was still buckled, but there was nothing inside it. The door handle was covered with a thin layer of ice, and when I breathed on the window, my breath fogged the glass from both sides, as if someone had been breathing on it from the outside. But the most unsettling detail was the smell that lingered in the air. Not the sweet floral scent I had noticed during the drive, but something else entirely. Something that reminded me of old churches and funeral homes. The particular odor of flowers and grief that clings to places where people go to say goodbye. I sat in that driveway for several minutes, trying to process what had happened. The rational part of my mind searched for logical explanations. Maybe she had gotten out while I was focused on finding the address. Maybe she had slipped away while I was distracted by the radio static. Maybe the cold and the ice were just the result of running the air conditioning too hot. But deep down, I knew something impossible had happened in my car. I decided to knock on the door of the house, thinking that maybe her family could explain what had happened. The front porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door, and I could see that the windows were not just dark, they were boarded up from the inside. Paint was peeling from the siding in long strips that fluttered in the desert wind like dead skin. I knocked anyway, more out of desperation than hope. The sound echoed through what was obviously an empty house, coming back to me as a hollow reverberation that suggested vast empty rooms beyond the door. As I turned to leave, I noticed the mailbox beside the front step. The name painted on the side was faded but still legible, Rodriguez. And underneath, in smaller letters, Maria Rodriguez, 1952 to 1977. 25 years old when she died, the same age as the woman who had vanished from my passenger seat. I drove back to the main part of Winslow and spent the night at a motel, unable to sleep, trying to convince myself that I had misread the mailbox or that the whole experience had been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee. But the next morning, I went to the Winslow Public Library and looked up Maria Rodriguez in their newspaper archives. She had died in October 1977, exactly 45 years ago to the day. Her car had broken down beside Route 66 near an old truck stop between Flagstaff and Winslow. She had been walking along the highway in a white dress, trying to get home to her family, when she was struck by a drunk driver who left the scene. Her body was found the next morning, but the driver was never caught. The newspaper article included a photograph of Maria Rodriguez taken at her high school graduation. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and large dark eyes, wearing the same white dress I had seen her in the night before. According to the article, several other drivers had reported seeing a young woman in white along that stretch of highway in the weeks following her death. All of them described the same experience, picking up a cold, quiet passenger who asked to be taken to Kinsley Avenue, only to discover that she had vanished when they reached her destination. The sightings had continued sporadically over the decades, always on the anniversary of her death, always involving drivers who were unfamiliar with the local legend. Drivers like me, I have spent the past 3 weeks researching phantom hitchhikers, trying to understand what I experienced that night. The phenomenon is more common than most people realize, with documented cases from every state in every decade going back to the early days of automobile travel. But the Route 66 sightings of Maria Rodriguez are among the most consistent and well-documented in American folklore. The experts have various theories about why certain spirits become attached to specific locations, why they continue to seek rides from strangers, why they always ask to be taken to places that hold significance from their living years. Some believe it is unfinished business, a desperate need to complete a journey that was interrupted by death. Others think it is a form of temporal echo, a psychic imprint left behind by traumatic events that replays itself under certain conditions. But I think the truth is simpler and more heartbreaking than any of the academic explanations. I think Maria Rodriguez is still trying to get home. Every year on the anniversary of her death, she appears beside that abandoned truck stop, still wearing the dress she died in, still cold and scared and desperate for someone to help her reach the place where she felt safe and loved. She does not understand that her family is gone, that her house is empty, that the world she knew has moved on without her. All she knows is that she needs to get home, and she trusts strangers to help her get there, just as she trusted the stranger who struck her down 45 years ago. I have not driven Route 66 at night since then. I stick to the interstate now, with its bright lights and constant traffic and reassuring signs of modern civilization. But sometimes, when I am driving alone through the desert darkness, I catch myself looking for her in my rearview mirror, wondering if she is still out there beside that abandoned truck stop, still waiting for someone to give her a ride home to a place that exists only in her memory. And sometimes I wonder if the next driver who stops for her will be someone who understands that compassion does not end with death, that helping a lost soul find peace is worth the risk of encountering something that cannot be explained. Because we are all just travelers on roads that lead to destinations we cannot see, and none of us knows when our own journey will end or what we might need from strangers when it does. Story 8. Black Dog of I-77. The black dog that saved my life was already dead when I first saw it standing in my headlights. I know that sounds impossible, but after what happened on Interstate 77 near Charlotte last month, I have learned that some warnings come from places beyond our understanding. Some guardians continue their watch long after their earthly duties should have ended. My name is Jake, and I haul refrigerated freight up and down the eastern seaboard. 16 years behind the wheel, carrying everything from frozen vegetables to medical supplies between Florida and New York. It is demanding work that requires strict attention to schedules, delivery windows, and federal regulations about driving hours. But it is honest work, and it pays well enough to support my family back home in Tennessee. The run that changed everything started on a Tuesday morning in Miami. I was hauling a full load of frozen seafood to a distribution center in Richmond, Virginia, a route I had driven dozens of times before. The cargo was valuable and temperature sensitive, which meant no delays, no extended breaks, and absolutely no room for error. I had been driving for 10 hours straight when I hit the outskirts of Charlotte around 2 in the morning. My logbook showed I still had legal driving time remaining, but my body was telling a different story. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead. My vision was starting to blur around the edges, and I kept catching myself drifting toward the shoulder when my attention wandered. Every experienced trucker knows the signs of dangerous fatigue. The micro-sleeps that last just a few seconds but feel like hours. The hallucinations that appear at the edge of your peripheral vision. The way familiar landmarks suddenly look foreign and threatening. I was well into that danger zone, but I was also only 30 miles from a truck stop where I could legally park for my mandatory rest period. 30 miles. I told myself I could make it 30 more miles. Interstate 77 north of Charlotte is a challenging stretch of highway even when you are fully alert. The road climbs and descends through rolling hills covered with dense pine forests, with curves that can catch you off guard if you are not paying attention. At night, with minimal traffic and no streetlights for long stretches, it becomes a ribbon of black asphalt threading through an ocean of darkness. I was about 15 miles past Charlotte, grinding up a long grade in the right lane, when I saw the dog. It appeared suddenly in my headlights, maybe 50 yards ahead, standing directly in the center of my lane. A massive black dog, easily the size of a German Shepherd but built more like a Rottweiler, with a broad chest and powerful legs. Its fur was so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the shape of a dog against the gray asphalt. But it was the eyes that made me slam on my brakes. They glowed bright red, like taillights in fog, casting an eerie crimson glow that extended several feet in every direction. Not the usual reflection you see when headlights hit animal eyes at night, but an internal light that seemed to burn from within the creature itself. I hit the air brakes hard enough to activate my hazard lights, my trailer swaying dangerously as 40 tons of truck and cargo fought against momentum and physics. The sudden deceleration should have thrown me forward against my seatbelt, but instead I felt a strange weightlessness, as if time itself had slowed down to give me more room to react. The dog never moved. It stood perfectly still in my lane, watching my truck bear down on it with those impossible red eyes. I was certain I was about to hit it, certain I was about to feel the horrible impact of an animal strike that would haunt me for the rest of my driving career. But at the last possible second, the dog simply vanished. Not ran away, not jumped aside, not darted into the forest. It disappeared completely, like someone had turned off a television screen. One moment it was there, solid and real and blocking my path, and the next moment there was nothing but empty highway stretching ahead of my headlights. I brought my rig to a complete stop in the middle of the interstate, hazard lights flashing, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my heart was hammering so hard I could hear it over the rumble of my diesel engine. The sudden rush of adrenaline had completely eliminated my fatigue. I felt more awake and alert than I had in hours, every nerve ending crackling with heightened awareness. It was as if the encounter with the phantom dog had reset my entire nervous system, burning away the accumulated exhaustion like fire consumes fog. I checked my mirrors, looking for any sign of the animal, any evidence that it had been real. The highway behind me was empty, no movement in the ditches or tree line, no glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness. But when I looked down at my dashboard, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My fuel gauge was sitting on empty. That was impossible. I had filled up in Jacksonville and calculated my fuel consumption carefully. I should have had at least a quarter tank remaining, enough to reach the truck stop ahead with fuel to spare. But the needle was definitely resting on the red line, and my low fuel warning light was blinking insistently. I had been so focused on fighting fatigue that I had completely missed the signs of a fuel emergency. If I had continued driving at highway speed, I would have run out of diesel within the next few miles, stranded on a dark highway with a load of frozen seafood that would spoil within hours. The black dog had forced me to stop just in time to realize my mistake. I managed to coast to the next exit, where a 24-hour truck stop sat like an island of fluorescent light in the Carolina darkness. As I pulled up to the fuel pumps, I could see other drivers walking around their rigs, performing their pre-trip inspections, going through the same routine I had performed thousands of times. But while I was filling my tank, I overheard a conversation that made me understand I was not the first driver to encounter the phantom dog of Interstate 77. Two drivers were standing near the coffee shop entrance, comparing notes about their experiences on the highway. The older man, a gray-haired veteran with the weathered look of someone who had been driving for decades, was describing an incident that sounded remarkably similar to mine. He had been fighting fatigue near the same stretch of highway when a large black dog had appeared in his headlights. The sudden encounter had jolted him awake just in time to realize that his trailer brakes were overheating and about to fail. The forced stop had probably saved his life and the lives of other drivers who might have been involved in a runaway truck accident. The younger driver had his own story. The black dog had appeared to him during a winter storm, forcing him to stop just before he would have driven into a massive pileup that was hidden around a curve by blowing snow. Emergency vehicles were already on scene, but their warning lights were not visible until it was almost too late. Both men spoke about the dog with a mixture of gratitude and unease, as if they understood they had been helped by something beyond normal explanation but were not entirely comfortable with the implications. I introduced myself and shared my own experience, and the older driver nodded knowingly. He told me the story behind the phantom dog, a local legend that had been passed down among truck drivers for more than 20 years. According to the story, the dog had belonged to a long-haul trucker named Bill Morrison who had driven the same routes I was driving now. Bill had been a fixture on Interstate 77 for 15 years, known for his safety record and his willingness to help other drivers in need. He always traveled with his black Rottweiler mix, a loyal companion named Diesel who rode shotgun in his cab and had become almost as well known among truckers as Bill himself. One night in 1998, Bill was driving through the same stretch of highway where I had encountered the phantom dog. He had been fighting fatigue after a long haul from Florida, but he was determined to reach his delivery appointment on time. Somewhere around 3 a.m, exhaustion finally overcame his determination. Bill fell asleep at the wheel. His truck drifted across the median and collided head-on with a southbound vehicle, killing Bill instantly and critically injuring the family in the other car. Diesel was found dead in the wreckage, still sitting in the passenger seat where he had ridden faithfully for thousands of miles. The accident investigation revealed that Bill had been driving far longer than federal regulations allowed, pushing himself beyond safe limits to meet an unrealistic delivery schedule. His death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of fatigue and the pressure that drivers face to prioritize schedules over safety. But within a few months of the accident, other drivers began reporting encounters with a large black dog on the same stretch of highway where Bill had died. The sightings always followed the same pattern. The dog would appear suddenly in the headlights of drivers who were fighting fatigue or facing other dangerous conditions. The encounter would force them to stop or slow down, often just in time to avoid accidents or mechanical failures that could have been fatal. The phantom dog never harmed anyone. It simply appeared long enough to get a driver's attention, then vanished without a trace. But its appearances were consistently associated with preventing accidents and saving lives, as if Diesel was continuing the work he had done in life, helping to keep other drivers safe on dangerous roads. Over the years, the legend had spread throughout the trucking community. Drivers who had never heard the story would encounter the dog and later learn about its history when they shared their experiences at truck stops and rest areas. The encounters were always described in remarkably similar terms: a massive black dog with glowing red eyes that appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly, leaving drivers shaken but alert and aware of dangers they had been too tired to notice. Some drivers were skeptical of the stories, dismissing them as hallucinations brought on by fatigue or wishful thinking. But others, like the men I met that night, spoke of their encounters with genuine conviction and gratitude. They believed they had been saved by something beyond normal explanation, protected by a guardian spirit that continued to watch over the highways long after its earthly journey had ended. I finished fueling my truck and continued north toward Richmond, but the encounter had changed something fundamental about how I viewed my profession and my responsibilities. The phantom dog had not just saved me from a fuel emergency, it had reminded me that safety was more important than schedules, that no delivery was worth risking lives, and that sometimes the warnings we need most come from unexpected sources. Over the next few weeks, I researched the legend more thoroughly, reading accident reports and newspaper archives about Bill Morrison and his dog. The facts were exactly as the older driver had described them. Bill had died in a fatigue-related accident on Interstate 77 in 1998, and reports of phantom dog sightings had begun shortly afterward. But I also discovered something else that gave me chills. The accident reports mentioned that Diesel had been wearing a red LED collar on the night he died, a safety device that Bill had purchased to make his dog more visible during nighttime stops. The collar had been damaged in the crash, but investigators noted that it had continued to flash intermittently even after the impact, casting an eerie red glow throughout the wreckage. The red eyes that so many drivers had reported seeing were not supernatural at all. They were the same LED lights that had once helped keep a loyal dog safe during his travels with his beloved owner. But understanding the source of the red glow did not diminish the mystery of how Diesel continued to appear to drivers in need. If anything, it made the encounters more poignant, suggesting that the bond between Bill and his dog had been strong enough to transcend death itself. I have driven Interstate 77 dozens of times since that night, and I have never seen the black dog again. But I know other drivers who have encountered it, and their stories always follow the same pattern. The dog appears to drivers who are in danger, forces them to confront whatever threat they have been too tired or distracted to notice, then disappears once its warning has been delivered. Some skeptics argue that the sightings are nothing more than shared hallucinations, that exhausted drivers see what they expect to see based on stories they have heard. But I know what I experienced that night was real, as real as the fuel gauge that saved me from being stranded on a dark highway with a truck full of spoiling cargo. I think Diesel is still out there, still riding shotgun on the highways he once knew so well, still helping to keep drivers safe just as he did when he was alive. He may no longer have a physical form, but his purpose remains unchanged, to watch over travelers and warn them when danger approaches. And perhaps that is the most fitting memorial for a faithful companion who spent his life protecting the person he loved most. Death may have ended his earthly journey, but it could not end his devotion to duty or his desire to help others avoid the tragedy that claimed his owner. The black dog of Interstate 77 reminds us that some bonds are stronger than death, some purposes transcend physical existence, and sometimes the help we need most comes from guardians we never knew were watching over us. In a profession where drivers spend long hours alone on dangerous roads, that is a comforting thought. We may drive solo, but we are never truly alone as long as loyal spirits like Diesel continue to patrol the highways, ready to appear when we need them most. The next time you see something unexplained in your headlights on a dark highway, do not dismiss it as fatigue or imagination. Pay attention to the warning it might be trying to give you. Check your gauges, test your brakes, pull over if you need rest. Because sometimes the difference between life and death is a phantom dog with glowing red eyes, standing in your lane just long enough to make you stop and think about what really matters. Story 9. Ghost in the Way Station. The man with the lantern was checking railroad tracks that had been torn up 30 years ago. I saw him through the window of the way station at 4:17 a.m., walking the line where freight trains used to roll through eastern Montana, swinging an old-fashioned kerosene lamp in the same steady rhythm railroad workers had used for over a century. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had walked those rails thousands of times, checking for loose spikes and cracked ties that could derail a fully loaded freight train traveling at 60 miles per hour. The problem was that the tracks had been removed in 1994. My name is Tom, and I drive heavy haul equipment across the northern states for a specialized transport company. Oversized loads, construction machinery, industrial equipment that requires special permits and careful route planning. It is precision work that demands attention to detail and strict adherence to weight regulations, which is why I was pulling into the Cascade County way station on Highway 87 at 4 in the morning instead of sleeping in a comfortable motel bed. The way station itself was an oddity, one of the few facilities in Montana that operated around the clock. Most rural way stations close at sunset and reopen at dawn, but this one maintained full staffing because of its location on a major freight corridor between Canada and the industrial centers of the Midwest. The building was old but well maintained, obviously constructed decades earlier and renovated to meet modern safety standards. What made it unusual was its architecture. Instead of the utilitarian concrete block construction typical of most way stations, this building had the distinctive brick facade and high windows of a railroad depot from the 1940s. The structure had clearly been repurposed, converted from its original function as a passenger and freight station into a highway facility when the railroad ceased operations through this area. I had stopped there dozens of times over the past 5 years, but I had never arrived in the middle of the night when the building was shrouded in darkness and the surrounding landscape disappeared into black void. The way platform was illuminated by harsh sodium lights that cast everything in sickly yellow, but beyond that circle of artificial daylight, the Montana prairie stretched away into absolute darkness. I pulled my truck onto the scale and waited for the attendant to process my paperwork. Through the large windows of the office, I could see a single clerk working at a desk covered with permits and logbooks. He looked tired in the way that comes from working graveyard shifts in isolated places, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that coffee cannot fix and sleep cannot cure. While I waited, I studied the building more carefully than I ever had during daytime stops. The renovation had been thorough but respectful of the original architecture. Original fixtures had been preserved where possible, and historical elements had been incorporated into the modern design. But it was the windows that caught my attention, tall and narrow in the style of railroad architecture, designed to provide clear views of the platforms and tracks where passengers and cargo had once moved through this remote outpost. That was when I saw the lantern light moving outside. It appeared first as a distant glow beyond the way station lights, a warm yellow radiance that stood out against the cold blue of the pre-dawn darkness. As I watched, the light began moving in a straight line parallel to the building, maintaining a constant height above the ground and swaying slightly with each step of whoever was carrying it. I rolled down my window to get a better view, and immediately I could hear the sound of footsteps on gravel, the steady crunch, crunch, crunch of work boots walking on railroad ballast. But there were no railroad tracks outside that building. The old right-of-way had been converted to a walking trail years ago, paved with asphalt and marked with recreational mile markers. The man carrying the lantern came into clearer view as he approached the area directly in front of the way station. He was wearing the heavy canvas work clothes typical of railroad employees from decades past, with suspenders and a brimmed cap that cast his face in shadow. His movements were methodical and purposeful, stopping every few steps to hold his lantern close to the ground, examining something that only he could see. He was conducting a track inspection, following the same safety protocols that railroad workers had used for generations to identify hazards that could cause derailments. But he was walking on empty ground, checking for problems on rails that no longer existed, maintaining infrastructure that had been removed before most current truck drivers had even gotten their commercial licenses. The attendant emerged from the office with my paperwork, and I pointed toward the figure with the lantern, asking if he knew who was walking around out there in the middle of the night. The clerk followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness beyond the station lights, then turned back to me with an expression I could not quite read. He told me to wait a moment and disappeared back into the office. When he returned, he was carrying a framed photograph that he held up to my window so I could see it clearly in the light from my cab. The photograph was black and white, obviously taken many decades earlier, showing a group of railroad workers posed in front of the same building where we were now standing. They were wearing the heavy work clothes and caps typical of the 1940s, holding the tools of their trade, signal lanterns, track inspection hammers, and maintenance equipment. The depot behind them looked exactly as it did now, except for the obvious signs of its railroad heritage, platform canopies, baggage carts, and the gleaming steel rails that had once carried freight and passenger trains through this remote section of Montana. But it was the man standing at the left edge of the photograph that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. He was holding a kerosene lantern identical to the one I had just seen outside, and his face, though partially shadowed by his cap, was clearly recognizable as the same person who was conducting his phantom inspection of non-existent railroad tracks. The attendant pointed to a small placard mounted below the photograph. It identified the image as having been taken in 1947, during the final years of passenger service through Cascade County. The man with the lantern was listed as Henry Morrison, section foreman, killed in a derailment while conducting emergency track repairs during a blizzard in February 1948. According to the placard, Morrison had been working alone to clear snow and ice from a switch that had frozen in the open position. An unscheduled freight train, running ahead of schedule to avoid the worst of the storm, had rounded a curve too fast for the engineer to see Morrison in time. The locomotive had struck him while he was still kneeling beside the track, lantern in hand, trying to free the mechanism that would have allowed the train to continue safely. The attendant explained that Morrison had been found the next morning, still holding his lantern, positioned as if he were continuing his work even after death. The railroad had honored him as a hero, a dedicated employee who had died trying to prevent an accident that could have killed the entire train crew. But the story did not end with Morrison's death. Within weeks of the accident, other railroad workers had begun reporting sightings of a figure with a lantern conducting track inspections during the night shift. The sightings always occurred during dangerous conditions: heavy snow, ice storms, equipment failures, or other emergencies that required extra vigilance to prevent derailments. The figure never interfered with living workers or caused any problems with train operations. He simply appeared during times of heightened risk, walking his section of track with the same diligence he had shown in life, as if death had not released him from his responsibility to keep the trains running safely. The sightings had continued until 1994, when the last freight train rolled through Cascade County and the rails were removed to make way for highway expansion. Most people assumed that would be the end of Morrison's vigil. that removing the tracks would finally allow him to rest. But the attendant told me that was not what had happened. When the way station had been constructed in the old depot building, workers had discovered that the original railroad right-of-way ran directly through the property. The tracks were gone, but the roadbed was still there, invisible under decades of accumulated soil and vegetation, but still following the same precise alignment that engineers had surveyed more than a century earlier. And Morrison was still walking his rounds. The sightings had resumed almost immediately after the way station opened. Always during the graveyard shift, always during conditions that demanded extra caution. Fog, ice, mechanical problems with the scales, power outages that could create safety hazards for truck traffic. Morrison appeared during these times, conducting the same methodical inspections he had performed in life, as if he understood that his vigil had simply shifted from protecting trains to protecting truckers. The attendant had been working at the station for 8 years, and he estimated that he had seen Morrison at least 40 times. Always the same figure, always carrying the same lantern, always walking the line of the old railroad grade with the same purposeful stride. Other employees had seen him too, as had truck drivers who happened to be getting weighed during his appearances. But Morrison never appeared during daylight hours, and he never acknowledged the presence of living people. He simply went about his work, invisible to most but clearly visible to those who happened to be in the right place at the right time to witness his continuing dedication to duty. The attendant handed me back my paperwork and permits, then pointed out toward where Morrison was still conducting his inspection. I could see the lantern light moving steadily along the invisible line of the old tracks, pausing occasionally as Morrison examined some detail that only he could perceive. As I watched, Morrison stopped directly in front of the way station and turned toward our building. For the first time, his lantern light illuminated his face clearly, and I could see the same features that had been captured in the 1947 photograph. But his expression was not one of sadness or confusion, as I might have expected from a ghost trapped by unfinished business. Instead, he looked satisfied, like a man who was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Morrison raised his lantern in what might have been a greeting or a signal, the kind of acknowledgement that railroad workers had traditionally given to passing trains. Then he turned and continued his inspection, walking away from the station with the same steady pace he had maintained for more than 70 years. I started my truck and pulled away from the way station, but I found myself checking my mirrors repeatedly, looking for the warm glow of Morrison, his lantern as it disappeared into the Montana darkness. The encounter had been brief and peaceful, but it had left me with a profound sense that I had witnessed something significant, something that challenged my understanding of how the world worked. Over the next several months, I made it a point to stop at that way station whenever my route took me through Cascade County. Most of the time, I saw nothing unusual. But on 3 occasions, during conditions of reduced visibility or mechanical problems with my equipment, I caught glimpses of Morrison, his lantern as he walked his eternal beat. Each sighting reinforced my growing understanding that Morrison was not a tormented spirit trapped by tragedy, but rather a dedicated professional who had found a way to continue serving others even after death. His vigil had evolved from protecting trains to protecting truck drivers, but his core mission remained unchanged, preventing accidents through careful attention to detail and unwavering commitment to safety. I began to research Morrison, his history more thoroughly, visiting local libraries and historical societies to learn more about his life and career. What I discovered was the story of a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to railroad safety, starting as a track laborer in the 1920s and working his way up to section foreman through decades of reliable service. Morrison had been known throughout the railroad system as someone who never cut corners, who always put safety ahead of schedules, and who took personal responsibility for every mile of track under his supervision. His personnel records, preserved in railroad historical archives, showed a perfect safety record spanning more than 20 years, with numerous commendations for preventing accidents through careful maintenance and vigilant inspection. The derailment that killed him had been the only serious accident ever recorded on his section of track, and investigation had shown that Morrison was not at fault. He had been trying to prevent a disaster, not responding to a problem he had missed. But for Morrison, personal blame was apparently less important than personal responsibility. Even death had not released him from his commitment to the safety of travelers who depended on the infrastructure he had devoted his life to maintaining. I have seen Morrison 4 more times since that first encounter, always during conditions that required extra caution, always in the same location where trains had once rolled and trucks now weigh their loads before continuing their journeys. Each sighting has reinforced my conviction that some dedication transcends death, that some sense of duty is strong enough to bridge the gap between life and whatever comes after. The last time I saw Morrison, he was walking through fog so thick I could barely see the front of my own truck. His lantern cut through the murk like a beacon, marking the safe path for travelers who might otherwise lose their way in conditions that could easily lead to disaster. As I pulled away from the way station that night, I realized that Morrison and I were part of the same tradition, separated by decades and different technologies but united by the same fundamental responsibility. We both spent our careers moving through dangerous conditions, carrying valuable cargo, depending on infrastructure maintained by people we would never meet. The difference is that Morrison's commitment to that responsibility was strong enough to survive death itself, transforming him from a railroad worker into something larger and more enduring. He became a guardian spirit, a protector of travelers, a reminder that some duties are sacred enough to last forever. In a world where people change jobs frequently and loyalty to employers is increasingly rare, Morrison's eternal vigil serves as a powerful example of what it means to find true purpose in your work. He understood that his job was not just about maintaining tracks or following procedures. It was about protecting human lives and enabling the commerce that keeps communities connected. That understanding was strong enough to survive the end of the railroad era, the removal of the tracks he had maintained, and even his own death. Morrison adapted his mission to new technologies and new travelers, but he never abandoned his core commitment to safety and service. The ghost in the way station reminds us that the most important work we do is not for our employers or our paychecks, but for the strangers who depend on us to do our jobs correctly. Morrison understood that every inspection he conducted, every hazard he identified, every problem he prevented might save the lives of people he would never meet. That knowledge gave his work a sacred dimension that transcended ordinary employment, transforming routine maintenance into a form of service that was worthy of eternal commitment. His lantern still burns because his purpose was never just about railroad tracks. It was about human connection, about the responsibility we all share to keep each other safe as we travel through a dangerous world. Story 10. Cursed cargo of antique mirrors. The man standing behind me in my truck mirrors had been dead for over a century. I could see him clearly in every reflective surface in my cab, a gaunt figure in a black Victorian suit, his hollow eyes burning with an anger that seemed to fill the small space with ice-cold malice. But every time I turned around to confront him, the passenger seat was empty. Only when I looked back at the mirrors did he reappear, closer each time, his pale hands reaching toward my shoulders. My name is Mike, and I run specialized freight across the Midwest. Fine art, antiques, museum pieces, the kind of valuable cargo that requires climate control and careful handling. 26 years in the business, and I had never transported anything that felt alive before that October shipment from Chicago to St. Louis. The load was 43 antique Victorian mirrors, each one wrapped in protective padding and secured in custom wooden crates. They were being delivered to Whitmore Estate Auctions, a high-end dealer that specialized in period pieces from the 1800s. The manifest listed them as originating from various estates across Illinois and Missouri, but it gave no details about their previous owners or history. I should have asked more questions. The trouble started 20 miles south of Chicago, just after I merged onto I-55 for the 4-hour drive to St. Louis. I was adjusting my rearview mirror when I first saw him standing in the sleeper area behind my driver's seat. A tall, thin man in formal black clothing, his skin pale as parchment and his eyes sunken deep into shadowed sockets. He looked like he had stepped out of a daguerreotype from the Civil War era. My heart nearly stopped, and I jerked the wheel hard enough to make my trailer sway. When I spun around to look directly at the sleeper compartment, it was empty except for my duffel bag and the usual clutter of life on the road. But when I glanced back at the mirror, he was still there, standing motionless with his arms at his sides, staring at the back of my head with an expression of barely contained rage. I pulled over at the next truck stop, convinced that fatigue was making me hallucinate. I had been driving since 5 that morning, and maybe the combination of coffee and road monotony was playing tricks with my vision. But when I walked around my trailer to inspect the load, I could hear sounds coming from inside that made my skin crawl. Soft tapping noises, like fingers drumming against glass. Whispered voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. The sound of something heavy sliding across the trailer floor, even though the mirrors were securely crated and strapped down. I opened the trailer doors to check the cargo, and immediately the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath started fogging in the sudden cold, and the whispered voices fell silent as if whatever was making them had suddenly become aware of my presence. The mirrors were exactly where they should be, properly secured and undamaged. But standing this close to them, I could feel something watching me from within those wooden crates. I closed the trailer and got back in my cab, telling myself that old mirrors sometimes make strange noises when the temperature changes. Expansion and contraction of the glass and frames. Nothing supernatural about it. But when I looked in my rearview mirror to back away from the loading dock, the man in black was standing even closer to my seat. This time I could see more details of his appearance. His hair was slicked back with some kind of oil or pomade, and his skin had the waxy, artificial look of someone who had been embalmed. His black suit was expensive but old-fashioned, with a high collar and silver buttons that caught the light from my instrument panel. Most unsettling were his hands, which were stained dark around the fingernails as if he worked with chemicals or dyes. I tried to ignore him and focus on driving, but his presence filled my cab like a toxic cloud. The air became thick and hard to breathe, carrying the smell of formaldehyde and flowers left too long in a closed room. My radio started picking up interference, bursts of static punctuated by what sounded like funeral organ music played at half speed. By the time I reached Springfield, I was seeing him in every mirror surface in my truck. Side mirrors, rearview mirror, even the reflection in my cell phone screen when I tried to call my dispatcher. Always the same pose, always the same furious expression, always standing just behind my driver's seat where no living person could fit. But it was not just his appearance that unnerved me. It was the way he seemed to be studying me, memorizing my movements and habits as if he were planning something. His eyes followed every gesture I made, tracked every adjustment of my mirrors, cataloged every moment when my attention was focused on the road ahead instead of the supernatural passenger who had somehow joined me for this cursed journey. The whispered voices from the trailer grew louder as the sun began to set. I could hear them clearly now despite the road noise and my diesel engine. Multiple voices speaking in overlapping conversations, discussing things I could not understand in accents that sounded like they came from another century. Sometimes I caught fragments of English mixed in with the foreign words, names, dates, addresses that meant nothing to me but seemed urgently important to whoever was speaking. Near Bloomington, I made the mistake of trying to communicate with my unwanted passenger. I spoke to his reflection in the rearview mirror, asking who he was and what he wanted from me. The response was immediate and terrifying. Every reflective surface in my cab suddenly showed not just one figure but dozens of them, all dressed in the same formal black clothing, all staring at me with the same hollow-eyed rage. They filled my mirrors like a crowd of mourners at a funeral, pressing against the glass as if they were trying to break through from whatever dimension they occupied into the physical world of my truck cab. I could see men, women, even children, all wearing the clothing styles of the Victorian era, all sharing the same pale, waxy complexion that suggested they had been dead for decades. The temperature in my cab plummeted to the point where frost began forming on the inside of my windshield. My engine started running rough, as if the supernatural cold was affecting its operation. The lights on my dashboard flickered in rhythm with the whispered voices from the trailer, and my CB radio erupted with static that sounded almost like screaming. I pulled into a rest area and called Whitmore Estate Auctions, hoping to get more information about the mirrors I was hauling. The woman who answered seemed reluctant to discuss the cargo in detail, but after I described what I was experiencing, she finally admitted that the mirrors had come from a single source rather than multiple estates as listed on the manifest. They had been salvaged from the Blackwood Funeral Home in Springfield, Illinois, which had been demolished earlier that year after standing vacant for 30 years. The funeral home had been owned and operated by the Blackwood family for 4 generations, from 1847 until 1963, when a scandal involving improper treatment of bodies had forced them out of business. According to historical records, Josiah Blackwood, the founder of the funeral home, had been a perfectionist who took unusual pride in preparing bodies for viewing. He had installed mirrors throughout his facility so that he could monitor his work from multiple angles, ensuring that every corpse met his exacting standards for presentation. But Josiah had also been rumored to engage in practices that went far beyond normal embalming procedures. Witnesses claimed that he kept bodies longer than necessary, that he spoke to them as if they were still alive, and that he became obsessed with capturing what he called the essence of the departed in his mirrors. When Josiah died in 1889, his son found him in the preparation room, collapsed in front of a large mirror, his hands stained with embalming chemicals. The mirror was cracked in a spiderweb pattern radiating out from a central point, as if it had been struck by something with tremendous force from the inside. The funeral home had continued operating under Josiah's descendants, but employees reported increasingly disturbing incidents over the decades. Mirrors that showed reflections of people who were not in the room. Voices of dead clients calling for help during the night shift. Bodies that seemed to move or change position when no one was watching. By the 1960s, the problems had become so severe that the funeral home could no longer attract qualified embalmers. The final scandal involved allegations that the current owner was selling organs and jewelry taken from corpses, but some investigators suspected the real issue was that something supernatural had taken up residence in the building and was driving away both customers and employees. After the business closed, the building had stood empty for decades, slowly deteriorating while the mirrors remained in place, covered with dust and cobwebs but apparently still retaining whatever essence Josiah Blackwood had trapped within them over a century of funeral preparation. The woman from Whitmore Auctions explained that the mirrors were being sold to collectors who specialized in haunted antiques, people who actively sought out objects with supernatural histories. She suggested that I avoid looking directly into any reflective surfaces until I completed the delivery, and she promised that someone would be waiting at the auction house to receive the cargo regardless of what time I arrived. But her warning came too late. As I hung up the phone, I made the mistake of glancing at my side mirror to check for traffic before pulling back onto the interstate. Instead of seeing the rest area behind me, I saw myself lying on what looked like an embalming table in a dimly lit room lined with mirrors. Josiah Blackwood was standing over my body with instruments I did not recognize, speaking in the same whispered voice I had been hearing from the trailer. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but it was clear enough to understand what Josiah wanted. He was not just traveling with me as a passive passenger. He was planning to add me to his collection, to trap my essence in his mirrors just as he had trapped so many others over the decades. I drove the final 100 miles to St. Louis without looking at a single mirror, relying on sound and peripheral vision to navigate traffic. The whispered voices from the trailer grew more insistent as we approached our destination, and I could feel Josiah's presence growing stronger, more solid, as if proximity to his ultimate goal was allowing him to draw more energy from whatever dimension he occupied. The Whitmore Estate Auctions warehouse was located in an industrial district near the Mississippi River, surrounded by abandoned buildings and empty lots that gave the area a desolate, haunted atmosphere. A single security light illuminated the loading dock where several workers waited to receive my cargo. As I backed up to the dock, I could see that the workers were not ordinary warehouse employees. They wore protective clothing similar to hazmat suits, and they carried equipment that looked more scientific than commercial. The lead worker explained that they were specialists who dealt exclusively with supernatural artifacts, and that the mirrors would be properly contained and prepared for sale to collectors who understood their true nature. The unloading process took less than an hour, but it felt like days. Each mirror that was removed from my trailer seemed to take some of the oppressive atmosphere with it, and gradually the temperature in my cab began to return to normal. The whispered voices faded, the radio interference stopped, and the overwhelming sense of being watched finally began to dissipate. But as the last mirror was carried into the warehouse, I made one final mistake. I glanced at my rearview mirror to check that the trailer was empty, and there was Josiah Blackwood, no longer standing behind my seat but pressed against the glass from inside the mirror itself, his face contorted with rage at having his collection taken away from him. He raised one stained hand and pressed it against the inner surface of the mirror, and I could see his mouth moving as he spoke words I could not hear but somehow understood. He was promising that this was not over, that he would find a way to reclaim what belonged to him, and that I had made myself a permanent target by transporting his precious mirrors away from the funeral home where they belonged. The workers assured me that Josiah could not leave the mirrors now that they were properly contained, but they recommended that I avoid driving past the site of the old Blackwood funeral home and that I never again transport antique mirrors without knowing their complete history. I have followed their advice for the past 3 months, but I still sometimes catch glimpses of Josiah in unexpected reflective surfaces. Store windows, puddles of water, even the black screen of my television when it is turned off. He is always wearing the same black suit, always staring at me with the same furious expression, always reminding me that some business transactions create debts that transcend death itself. The antique mirror trade continues to thrive, and collectors still seek out pieces with supernatural histories. But I have learned that some objects retain more than just the memories of their previous owners. Some mirrors hold fragments of souls that refuse to accept that their earthly duties have ended. Josiah Blackwood spent his life preparing bodies for their final rest, but he never learned how to rest himself. His mirrors became prisons where he trapped not only the essence of others but ultimately his own spirit, creating a collection that grows larger with each person who looks too deeply into glass that was never meant to reflect the living.